This is MHS Talks Education, NAGC 2023. MHS recently attended the National Association for Gifted Children annual conference. We spoke with gifted education professionals, psychologists, and researchers, among others, about strategies and best practices for supporting gifted children and their communities. Justin Dubb is a school psychologist and licensed educational psychologist working with the Meerman School in Los Angeles. At NAGC, Justin and colleagues presented on Believe in Black Genius, lessons from affinity spaces for gifted students of color. So, what is an affinity space?
An affinity space is a unique opportunity to build community, to have authentic conversations, to have candid conversations with those who share some form of identity with you. And so that identity may be racial identity, that could be gender identity, that could be a cultural or ethnic identity, that could be a linguistic identity. I mean, we could go on down the line in terms of the things that bring us together and the things that lead to some form of shared experience. But the beauty of affinity spaces is that none of these groups, even with those shared identities, are a monolith, and that we begin to expose, in the case of a Black student affinity group, our Black students to differences amongst the Black experience. And so I think that is rich because you find commonality and you also find the differences and you see the diversity within this group that is oftentimes lumped together.
Why do you feel that affinity spaces are critical for student success?
Just this inherent feeling that there's a belief that you deserve to be in a space is so critical to feeling confident and to performing well in that space. I think when we think about Black students specifically, society tells them oftentimes many things that are contrary to giftedness. And so if you begin to internalize these messages, then naturally through stereotype threat and just through the discomfort that you may feel in these spaces, you may not perform at your peak potential, you may not feel particularly comfortable, and you may not feel particularly comforted or supported. I think it's important that we reflect on the messages that our Black students receive and how we attack or attempt to combat these messages to create a narrative that's more affirming and accurate.
What can educators do to promote belongingness and support the academic success of Black gifted students?
I think about the idea of windows and mirrors. I think that there need to be adequate opportunities, particularly on the mirror side, for Black students to see themselves represented. And that's in the curriculum, that's in the faculty, that's in the staff, that's in the people that you bring in to speak. Oftentimes in gifted and talented programs, Black students will represent a very small percentage of that population. And so we have to supplement that with ensuring that they see themselves in other respects. And that, again, they get that sense of belonging. They feel like I belong here. They don't feel as though my Blackness contrasts or conflicts with giftedness. And these things can co-occur. And if anything, my Blackness can contribute positively to my success in this gifted space.
What are some roadblocks that impede us from creating affinity spaces?
There are a lot of roadblocks. I think staffing, oftentimes in education, we are tasked or charged to do more with less. So we have to just really acknowledge the fact that educators are stressed, they have a lot on their plates. And so particularly educators of color who are asked to, be sort of this child whisperer for these students of color, oftentimes in addition to all of the roles they already have. And that can be a heavy burden to bear. And so, we have to reflect on, is it realistic or is it a reasonable expectation to ask them to be in charge of this affinity space solely without taking something else off their plate? There's also just the issue of whataboutism. Well, if we have an affinity space for these kids, why don't we have one for these other students? And so there is this need to center equity rather than equality. Equity, this idea that people need the things that they need in light of their unique situations and circumstances, and giving everyone the same thing is inherently flawed and inherently inequitable. And then also just things like legalities. Federal law does have some issues with creating affinity spaces that are specifically for one race at the exclusion of anyone else. And so that's why public schools oftentimes may need to start alliance spaces where co-conspirators, where allies can be a part of the space and no one is excluded. Whereas independent schools may have a little bit more leeway to say, this is a space specifically for Black students, this is a space specifically for Jewish students, this is a space for any other identifier that may be relevant in that community.
What do you hope educators take away from your talk at NAGC?
I hope they take away the fact that they can do this. You can do this. While there are limitations in public spaces, and perhaps you'll have to approach it from an alliance space rather than an affinity space, I think you can and should do this. I think we can and should reflect on not just how many Black students do we admit into gifted and talented programs, but how do we prepare these spaces for them, and how do we support them when they're in these spaces? What types of experiences are they having? It's not enough simply to be there. If you are dreading it, if you're being harmed, if you're being mistreated, if you're being isolated, we want Black students to thrive in gifted and talented spaces or any educational space in which they find themselves in.
Stay tuned for more videos in this MHS Talks education series. Follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn at MHS for more.